We're holding chapter 3 in the Maimer V'isha Achas. This is a Maimer that the Rebbe said on Chaf Cheshvan, the evening of Chaf Cheshvan, the 20th of Cheshvan, which is the birthday of the Rebbe Rashab of the 5th Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dovber. And it was, it's the title of the Maimer V'isha Achas is taken from the Haftarah for Shabbos Parshas Vayera, which is this Shabbos. So it's that's the Shabbos typically before Chav Cheshvan. So the title of the Maimer is a verse taken from this week's Haftorah. And in the first class, we brought a Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, actually two discourses of the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe explains this episode in Tanakh, a famous story of the woman who came to Elisha, to the prophet Elisha. She was a widow, and she said that her husband died. She's left with bills, and the creditors are threatening to come take her children as slaves. So Elisha tells her to go borrow. He asks her, "What do you have?" She says she has nothing except for a small little jar of oil. So Elisha says, "Go out and borrow vessels from all your neighbors. Get as many vessels as you can. Kelim reikim al tamiti. Don't have less. Don't minimize the amount of vessels that you can get. Get as many as you can, and start pouring from the jar of oil into the vessels. And then you will be able to sell." So she goes ahead and she does that, and finally she miraculously is filling all the jars with oil from this small little jar. And once they run out of vessels, she comes back to Elisha, who says, "Okay, go ahead and sell all the oil. You'll be able to pay off your creditors, and you and your children will be able to live off the interest, off the extra, off the surplus, of the profit." So that's the story in Tanakh. The Alter Rebbe explains this mystically and explains it in the relevance in our lives, and says that the Isha Achas, this woman, the widow, represents the soul. The soul cries out to God, to Elisha, the reference to God, saying that its love and fear, the love and awe that it has for God is dead, is gone. Its fire, the fire that it has, the burning desire and passion for God, is no longer there. Not only is that no longer there, not only is the soul not feeling this love and fear of God, but the creditor, the Noisha, meaning the animal soul, is coming to take its children, its love, the passion and the desire that the soul had, that it naturally has towards God. That passion, not only is it seeking to cause the soul to forget or not to feel, not to sense that love, but it's trying to convert that love to foreign passions and desires. That the passion should be redirected from God towards earthly, worldly matters. So what is the soul told? That God says, "Go out and get all these empty vessels, and you'll fill." God says, "What do you have left what's left in the tank?" So the soul says, "All I have is a small jar of oil." That represents the essence of the soul, the essence of the soul that remains intact. So God says, "Go ahead and get a bunch of empty vessels and pour from that essence of the soul into the empty vessels. And then you and your children meaning your love and your fear of God, will be able to live off the extra." What does it mean that the soul should get empty vessels? So here we have two versions, two interpretations from the Alter Rebbe in two different discourses. In one, the Alter Rebbe says that the empty vessels means study Torah and perform mitzvahs without love and fear. Why is it called empty vessels? We know, like we talked about last week, it says in Tanya that when a person does a mitzvah or studies Torah without an accompanying love and a fear of God, without the awe and without the kavanah, the intent, which is the motivation of love and fear, when your act is not infused with that, so that's like an empty vessel. It's like a guf, b'lei neshama, it's like a body without a soul. Body without a soul. It's a vessel without anything, and it's an empty vessel. So God is telling the soul, you don't feel any passion, you're not passionate about serving me, serve me anyway. Even without that love and fear, even if it's empty, but do it anyway. Keep on putting out empty vessels. And but how do you put out the empty vessels? How is it that you can serve God without that motivation? So the answer is to pour from that jar of oil, from the essence of the soul. And we explained a little bit at length last week the strategy that Alter Rebbe offers in Tanya, where he says that a person who's struggling to serve God, so if you remember that you're willing to give your life for God, that when you're put against the wall, and push comes to shove, you will not be able to denounce God and live, but you'd rather give your life for God. So if you recognize that every mitzvah is an opportunity either to connect or, God forbid, to disconnect from God, or every time you study Torah, it's like another connection. So then you could sort of, to a certain degree, artificially. I mean, it's not really artificial, but in a certain sense, it is. You can sort of artificially make it a situation of life and death, where you can recognize that if I would die for God, then certainly now, where it's not a situation of life and death, I certainly should overpower and overwhelm my instincts and my desires to go elsewhere and to serve God. So where does that come from? It comes from the essence of the soul. That's the small jar of oil. Meaning you recognize that your essence of your soul can never be disconnected from God, so therefore you can then sort of prompt yourself, in a sense, trick yourself into performing Torah mitzvahs even without that love and fear of God. So that's the jar of oil that you're going to pour into the empty vessels. What happens then? Then is then you and your children will live off of the extra, off of the surplus. What does that mean? That there's a certain advantage that comes, light that comes from darkness. There's a yisrei na'or min ha'cheshach. There's an advantage of light that comes from the darkness. So if you're serving God, so what does that mean here? It means that when you're in a situation of darkness, you're in a status of darkness, meaning you're not feeling particularly inspired in your service of God. Nevertheless, what do? Into that dark space, you shine a light. You perform mitzvahs or you study Torah. That's a light that you start shining into that darkness. Well, in order to shine a light into a dark space, you need a strong light. The stronger the darkness, the stronger the light that's necessary to illuminate the darkness. So we're talking about a light, the advantage of serving God in a state of darkness over serving God in a state of day or of light. So when we serve God, when we're not inspired, there's a certain advantage to that service over serving God when we are inspired. Because in order to fill that dark space, the uninspired area of your life, with godliness, you need a stronger light for that. So there's a certain intensity to the service of God that happens in that time. That's the Yisrei Na'or min ha'cheshach. That's what the words of the verse mean when it says that you will live off of this surplus, meaning there's a certain advantage, there's a surplus, there's a profit, there's a bonus that you get when serving God in this way with empty vessels. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation the Alter Rebbe gives is that the Kelim Reike means not that you should have empty vessels, meaning your acts should be acts that are hollow, but that that you recognize that you're hollow, you're an empty vessel. Meaning when you recognize that you yourself are empty, you're lacking any kind of inspiration, you're lacking any kind of motivation, and that love and the awe of God. So when you start to think deeply into your situation, into your spiritual status, your spiritual state, then what will happen? You'll become saddened by it. It'll bother you. And what happens when you're bothered by that? So when you are bothered by the fact that after reflecting on your lowly status, that being bothered by that realization, that then causes you to access the essence of the soul, that small jar of oil that's intact, and through that you come to so you get to a benefit of the light that comes from darkness. What does that mean here? So as we explained in chapter 2, there's a difference between these two interpretations. We explained before about the first interpretation, that when we're talking about doing Torah and mitzvahs, so what's the Yisrei Na'or min ha'cheshach? What does it mean that there's a benefit to the light that comes from the darkness? Is that you're shining a light into the darkness. Torah and mitzvahs are light. In order to illuminate that dark space that you're in, you need a stronger, more intense service of God. So therefore, the act of serving God, even when you're uninspired, even in that state of darkness, that brings out a more intense light that could illuminate that darkness. That's one benefit.
Or is that just required?
It's required. That's what comes out. But that's what happens. In order to actually do it, that brings out a greater light. It pulls it out. So we see that the Yisrei Na'or min ha'cheshach here means that both, we're talking about light. We're talking about light because Torah mitzvahs are light. And what does it mean that it's Yisrei Na'or min ha'cheshach? It's that we're shining a light into darkness. But according to the second interpretation of the Alter Rebbe, according to the interpretation that what is the empty vessels? It means that we reflect on our emptiness, on our lowly status, and that's something that gets us all distraught and breaks us down. So here, what's the Yisrei Na'or min ha'cheshach mean? It means that you're reaching a higher level. As he says here in the Maimer, that at the end of chapter 2, we finished last week, that you reach the level of Yashas Cheshach Sisrei, the level of darkness that's higher than light. And so you reach a level of darkness that's beyond light. So Yisrael and Cheshach, the benefit of the light, the advantage of the light that comes from the darkness, first interpretation is that there's a stronger light to illuminate the darkness. The second interpretation is that you reach a level that's higher than light. The level of darkness that's higher than light. God conceals himself in the darkness. That darkness is where you can find God's essence. It's too intense, it's too great to shine, to be light, and so we call it darkness. And so when a person reflects on their lowly status, what do they here? There is no light. So you're reflecting on your own darkness. And when you reflect on your own darkness, what does that cause? That causes an intense yearning and longing for God. So what's causing the longing and yearning for God? Your lowly status. So we see that the darkness itself is what brings out a higher level, brings out that level of not light, but the darkness that's beyond light. Does that make any sense? So it's two different levels of Yisr Norim and Acheshach. When we say Ata B'nai Tichim B'naiser, you and your children will live off the surplus, off the interest, of what's left over, there are two different interpretations. When we say that we're talking about Torah and mitzvahs, then the advantage of the light that comes from darkness is we're talking about a great light that shines into the darkness. But when we say that we're talking about a level when we say that you're coming to it as a result of thinking about reflecting on your lowly status, and when you recognize your lowly status, you're overwhelmed with a yearning. Suddenly you come to your senses and you say, I need to connect to God. So what's spurring that yearning, that longing for God, is the darkness itself. So the sadness that comes from the darkness. So it's the darkness itself that's fueling your desire to connect to God. So that reaches a higher level, even higher than light. That's the darkness itself. So there's an advantage of the darkness that's even beyond light, that's greater than light. Either way, what are we doing? Either way, whether we're talking about serving God with empty vessels, meaning overriding our desires and our passions and serving God because we're recalling the fact that we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for God. Or if we're talking about that we're reaching a level of yearning and longing for God that comes as a result of recognizing how low we are, which then awakens our essence of our soul. Either way, we're talking about the essence of the soul. Either way, that's what we're talking about, accessing that jar of oil and reaching the essence of the soul. So what does that mean? What's then the difference between these two? How is it that through Torah we reach one level, which is a greater light, and through reflecting on our lowliness, we reach the darkness that's beyond light? What exactly does this mean? So here, chapter 3, the Rebbe explains the difference. Chapter 3. So we can explain this distinction between these two interpretations of the Alter Rebbe about Kelim Reikim Al Tamiti, about the empty vessels, and about the light that we reach as a result of the vessels. So we explained already in chapter 2 the difference. One reaches a higher level, one reaches a great light that's beyond, that comes from the essence, and the other one reaches the darkness that's beyond that, even higher than that light. What does this mean? What's the difference? So Yuvan Al Pi Mashakasa B'Likutei Torah, we can understand based on what Alter Rebbe says in Likutei Torah. The Inyan Atu B'nai Tichi B'Noisra Al Derech Masham Razal Al Pasuk L'Sheiris Tachalasei. So the Alter Rebbe explains that in Likutei Torah, so in another Maimer, the Alter Rebbe says that this idea of Ata B'nai Tichi B'Noisar, you and your children will live off the extra. So Noisar, the extra, the word Noisar, which means the extra, he compares it to what Chazal say. The Gemara says, the verse says L'Sheiris Nachalasi. There's a verse in the verse in Micha. We just had it we just read this over and over again in the high holidays in Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. Mikael Kamecha. So we're referencing the 13 attributes of divine mercy. We say it during Tashlich, there's the 13, there's the 9. Right, then we got into, we quote this verse as well on Yom Kippur repeatedly. So we're talking about the divine attributes of mercy, and these divine attributes are Lish'eris Nachalase, to the remnant of your inheritance, meaning to the leftover people, to the remnants of your people. What does that mean, to the remnant of your people? So the Gemara says, the Gemara there talks about God's forgiveness and His compassion, and who God forgives and who He's compassionate to, and the way a person is a person who overlooks people wronging Him, so God overlooks that as well. Anyway, the Gemara says over there, this verse, that God elicits compassion on who l'she'eris nachalase, to somebody who who makes himself somebody who makes himself as if he's extra. What does it mean, makes himself as if he's extra? Meaning somebody who's humble. Somebody who's humble, meaning somebody who's also somebody who could forgive others because he himself is humble, so he doesn't feel anybody wronged him. There's a word, I think it's from Mendel Futterfass, who says that it says we say in Krishma Shalamita before going to sleep. So we say there's a prayer there where we say that we forgive anybody who might have wronged us. So we're not going to repeat the whole word here now, but just the question itself is a good one. Where he says, you have to forgive somebody wrong. Who are you that you think somebody wronged you? It's already a Chassidic question that, the answer we'll leave for another time. But just that question, who do you think you are that you could say, I forgive everybody that wronged me? And who do you think you are that you think somebody wronged you? It's a certain attitude. When you're humble, so you're just a lot more tolerant and easygoing. People are not constantly getting in your way and interfering. You don't take yourself as seriously. So somebody who's meisem atzmei keshirayim, somebody who considers himself like extra, meaning he's not that important. So it's somebody like that, somebody with such an attitude, who God shines His divine compassion upon. So this idea of being extra, of shirayim, so we can look at it in two ways. Leftovers are, you sit down, you have dinner, and you have leftovers, and people don't like leftovers, right? Because you want to eat something fresh. Leftovers, you roll your eyes when you're being served leftovers. Nobody wants leftovers. Leftovers are not important. So when you had a meal, everything was amazing. Then when it goes from being a meal to becoming leftovers, suddenly you don't take it seriously. It's leftovers. Leftovers is something that people consider insignificant. But you can also say in the reverse. So this idea that the person considers himself like leftovers, like extra, like surplus, and therefore is not that important, and therefore what does God do? He shines the divine attributes of mercy onto him. Divine attributes of mercy are beyond even the order of creation. They're a very high level of godliness that are above and beyond. So there's a deeper connection. It's not just that you're humble, so therefore God acts kindly and tolerantly with you, but it's almost like a tit for tat. It's a midah keneged midah. When you consider yourself like a remnant, so what does God do? That elicits within God His leftovers, as it were. What does it mean that it's His leftovers? Something that's too big to come down into the natural order. So in other words, when we talk about God's divine energy that fills the universe, that fills creation, so there's the energy that comes into creation. That's a limited energy. It's a limited force of godliness. But then there's the extra, the leftover. But here, leftover doesn't mean the insignificant. Here, leftover means the part that's too intense, that's too great, that's too infinite to come into that finite space. So when a person considers himself like leftovers in this world, that elicits from God the opposite, the other end of the spectrum in the leftovers, the divine energy that's too great for this world, and we can call it leftovers. Okay. So Mevar Shem, so Alter Rebbe explains based on this, so the Alter Rebbe connects this teaching in the Gemara of L'Sheiris Nachalasei, that God elicits the Kel Kamoicha, Neizavim, Ve'Ral Pesha, those divine attributes of mercy for somebody who's Misha Meitzim Atzmei Keshirayim. That's what the Gemara says, somebody who considers himself like leftovers. And the Alter Rebbe connects this with the idea of Atav V'Nachtichi B'Noi, so you live also on the leftovers. And he explains that the Shirayim, what are Shirayim? What are these leftovers? Those are the level of transcendent light, transcendent energy that's higher than Hishtalshus, that's higher than fitting into the natural order of creation. The divine energy that permeates creation, that enters into creation, that's only a ha'ara, it's only an effusion of light. But the ikar ha'or hamakifim nishar l'mayla shiraim. But the main light, it's explained, this is a little off the topic, so let's not get into it, won't get sidetracked, but when we talk about God creating the universe, so there's divine essence and then there's the divine light that's higher than creation. When it comes to actually creating a finite, limited world, so the only divine energy that enters into that world it's a ha'ara, it's an effusion of the light. So it's like a reflection of the light. It's not the actual light itself, which is too intense. So it's a lower level of godliness. What happens to the rest of godliness? That the rest of that divine energy, the higher, more intense energy, that doesn't enter. That's called shirayim. That's what we call leftovers, the shirayim. So how does one draw those makifim, those transcendent lights, that transcendent energy. So bittul, it's through bittul, through self-nullification and self-effacement. This then is the meaning of somebody who makes himself, as if he's left over, makes himself insignificant, through somebody literally considering himself to be nothing, bittul. It's through this attitude, through this form of service of God, when a person doesn't considers himself as nothing, that he can then elicit and draw the makifim, the shirayim, and the other end of the spectrum, the light, the leftovers that are beyond entering into the world. When a person serves God, but in a way of mitzias, meaning in a way that he plays a prominent role, takes up a significant space, even when a person serves God on a very high level. When a person's service of God, even if it's a very advanced and very high level of service of God, but when the service of God revolves around his own personhood, his own existence, his own interest, so then the light that he can draw is one that's limited, because as great as you might be, and as advanced as you might be in your service of God, you're still a limited person. You're a limited being and a limited creation. And so therefore, what you could elicit is, if what you're eliciting is related, is anchored to your existence, because your service of God is limited to your experience, your existence, so then what you can draw is only something that can fit into your existence. So you're drawing a limited energy. But in order to draw a divine energy that's beyond that, beyond any of these limitations, it's when you break down those barriers of your own existence. When a person is humbled and considers themselves insignificant, so when suddenly they erase those lines, those limitations, then they can draw from beyond. Okay, before so it's explained. Al Rebbe explains also in the verse says, "Hashemayim kisi," the heavens is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. The verse says, where is the house that you've built for me, the place of my resting? And then the pasuk continues. The verse continues. This is, who do I turn to? God says, who do I face? Who do I turn to? Is to the poor person and the broken, the one who has a broken spirit, meaning somebody who's humble. The idea of Shamayim Kisi, that the heavens is my throne. What is the heavens? The heavens is a reference to serving God through study Torah. Torah study is considered Shamayim, Torah, and Mayim and Shamayim. That represents Shamayim represents Torah. So when a person studies Torah, that is my throne. Meaning you're drawing a limited level that can come that can invest in a limited fashion, and and then aretz, when it says land, that's mitzvahs. Those are the commandments. Mitzvahs are related to the land that desires to fulfill God's will. So that's also an pnimi, meaning that's an internalized kind of a light, as referenced by the pasuk saying Shemayim, which is the service of study Torah, is kisi, my seat. That represents a limited invested, a light that could be invested. And aretz and hadoim ragli, my footstool, also that represents also God's light coming into an invested sort of fashion, which means by definition that the light is a limited light. So through Shemayim and aretz, through Torah and mitzvahs, that a person performs in a way of mitzias, in a way that he is the one who's performing that service. That's a limited light. But who does God turn to in a way that's beyond those limitations? The house, the bayis, that who's going to build that house? Bayis, which represents a transcendent form of light. I'm sorry, let's read it again. How does one draw the energy of bayis, of a house, which is a transcendent light? That is through anu nechei ruach, through a broken spirit, a poor person, meaning somebody who's humble. So, this is a bracketed text. Let's try and finish this paragraph. How are we doing on time? What time is it? It's 9 o'clock, so we can keep going. But let's return here in a second. Let's just finish the paragraph and we'll get back to this. Going back to what the Alter Rebbe explains about the connection between the She'eris Nachalasai and Ata B'nai Chtichi B'Noisor. The Alter Rebbe then concludes that there's a Chazal say, the Medrash says that Ata B'nai Chtichi B'Noisor, what's Noisor, the extra, the surplus, that is Ad Sheyichi Amesim, you will live until, meaning you merit the resurrection of the dead. The Noisor, Noisor, this idea of the extra, that represents the transcendent divine energy. And in Makif itself, and transcendent itself, it's the distant transcendence. Atik, the Arich Makif, Hakariv Atik, Makif Arachik. Arich is the closer Makif. And Atik is a more distant makif. This then is the meaning of Noisor, the extra meaning Gichyu Amesim, the Tchias Amesim, or Al Yidei Tala the Natif Matika, because as the Zohar says, that Tchias Amesim, the resurrection, comes from the dew that drips from Atik. What does all this mean? There's a lot of mystical stuff here. Let's work our way through this. Okay. So Alter Rebbe mentions over here the idea of Makif Harachik, a Makif HaKariv, a distant transcendent light and a closer transcendent light. We talked about bias, right? Is a bias assertivnuli in the brackets, the house that you can build for me. How do you elicit that level of house, which is a transcendent light? That's through a humbled spirit. And then we get into the resurrection, and the idea that the resurrection comes from Tala Denatif Matika, the dew that comes from Atik. What does this mean? We mentioned Atik and Arich. So, in Kabbalah, you find that it discusses Keser, the level of Keser, which is the crown. So we know we have the 10 divine attributes that start with Chachma, going all the way down to Malchus. The 10 divine attributes. Any chart you'll see of a Kabbalistic chart, a mystical chart, will have the 10 attributes, 10 faculties. But then there's Keser, the crown. Where does that fit in? Is that part of the 10? Is it related to the 10? It's not related to the 10. So in Kabbalah you find in some places where it talks about Keser being beyond, not being related to the 10 attributes. Other places you find that it is related to 10 attributes. How does this work? So the Arizal actually compromises and ties these together, and he explains like this, that Keser has 2 levels in it. There are 2 levels in Keser. There's Atik and Arich. Arich is the lower level. Arich is the level of Keser that is connected, or that becomes a source for the 10 attributes that come after it. And Atik, which is the deeper, the higher level of Keser, that's a level that's Atik. The word Atik comes from the term netak, it's cut off, or it's disconnected, it's removed from the 10 attributes, it's beyond it. So it's removed from it. So here you have like the compromise. So Keser, on one hand, it depends what level of Keser we're talking about. The higher level is removed from the 10 attributes. The lower level is connected to 10 attributes. That's a little bit mystical. Practically speaking, so you have Keser, we know in Chassidus talks about Keser being Ratzon, will. So you have your will that is beyond your capacity. Will is the highest, the strongest power. It's considered the strongest power in the person. It's even beyond your intellect. So even if you're intelligent, and even if you're emotional, and that's what drives you, but your will is the highest force within you, and the will is beyond your attributes, your intellect, and your emotions. The will then comes and informs your emotions. You have a desire for something, and then you can start rationalizing it, you can start having a feeling towards it. All that comes as a result of the will. So the will is sort of a source, becomes a source for your intellect and your emotions. Because you have a certain will, that taints, in a sense, it skews your vision, your perspective, your understanding, your intellect, and your emotions in a certain way based on your will. So you see the will is connected to your attributes, even though it's beyond it. Just like your divine attribute, your faculties. So your intellect is in the mind, and the heart, and the emotions are in the heart. Where's your will? Your will is everywhere equally. You feel your will when you have an overwhelming desire for something. You feel it everywhere in your body equally because it's beyond all of it. So will is a transcendent power. It's not one that's invested in a specific part of the body, unlike your intellect and your emotions, which are invested specifically in a certain part of the person. So we see that will is transcendent. On the other hand, even though it's transcendent, but it's a transcendence that's related to the rest of you. So in a sense, that's what's called a makif hakariv, a close makif. It's transcendent, but it's close. And the analogy to that is clothing. Your clothing are something that you wear, they go around you, they transcend, right? There's something that don't go into you, unlike food, which is internalized. Your clothing go around you. but your clothing are fitted to you. You wear clothes that fit you. So on the one hand, they're transcendent. On the other hand, they fit. Not only they fit not just in terms of size, but even style. You have a certain style, you have a certain fashion sense, and your fashion sense is how is reflected in your clothing. So the clothing are much closer or closely related to you, even though they're outside of you. They're transcendent, but they're related. That's makif hakarev, a close makif. Then there's makif harachik, a distant makif. What's a distant makif? A house. A home, when you're in your house, so the house surrounds you as well. But the house is not fitted to you. So yeah, there's different levels. Obviously, you're gonna design your house for yourself, etc. But the point is certainly in contrasting to clothing, the house is not something that fits to the person. That's something beyond the person. So that represents a distant makif, a higher level of makif. But as it relates to keser, to that higher level, beyond the 10 attributes, the internalized attributes, the attributes of God that come and are invested in the world. So you have the makif hakarev, makif harochik. You have arich, which is related to creation. So even though it's a transcendent light that's beyond creation, it doesn't enter, it's transcendent, but it's a source for creation. It's still related. And then you have the makif harochik, the higher level that's totally removed and it's beyond. That's the level of atik. So what the pasuk is telling us, Shemaim Kisi, that the Rebbe brings in here parenthetically from another Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, is that Torah mitzvahs, those are internalized. You study Torah, you're using your mind. You're doing mitzvahs, you're using your body, you're using your will that's engaged in serving God. So that elicits a light of godliness that's within creation. A light of godliness that can fit into creation. But humility, when a person is humbled and serves God not based on their own sense of self, without that self-awareness, so now you've opened yourself up to a light that's beyond, that's not limited to you, because you're not serving God in a limited capacity. So humility elicits a light that's even beyond it. And which type of energy does it elicit? It elicits the makif harachik, the bias, that level of godliness that's even distant, that's beyond all of it. So this, we're not going to have time to finish the second paragraph here now, but this is what the Rebbe is leading here now to explaining the difference between these two interpretations of the verse, whether the empty vessels represent hollow acts of Torah mitzvahs, meaning ones that are not infused with a passion, with a love and fear of God, or we're talking about humility, that when we're talking about serving God, performing mitzvahs without that passion, that would elicit that closer, the makif hakarev, the lower level of makif, the one that's connected to a person's conscious service of God. And why we'll have to explain why that is exactly. We'll get to in the next paragraph. But the humility, when we interpret the idea of kelim reikim, empty vessels, as just an awareness of a person being broken-hearted, a person being humbled before God, and because of his lowly state and his distance from God, that elicits the higher level of makif. So we set that up. This first paragraph of chapter 3 gives us this background of a higher makif, a lower makif, that then will allow us to appreciate the difference between these two interpretations of atav and of both of kelim reikim al tamiti, the empty vessels. What does that mean? Performing Torah mitzvahs, or does it mean humility? And the atav and so you're going to live off the surplus. Whether that means a higher makif or a lower makif, that we'll get to, God willing, in the next paragraph.